Hello everyone, and welcome back to Voices of Horror. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please leave a comment letting me know, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 1. It was an unusually quiet evening when I first heard the faint scratching sound. I just settled in with a book and a cup of tea, enjoying the calm of my small apartment. At first, I thought it was nothing, a random noise from outside or maybe just my imagination. But as I tried to focus on my book, the scratching kept going, growing slightly louder and more distinct. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was a rodent or a minor issue with the building, I told myself. But as the hours passed, the scratching continued, rhythmic and persistent. It seemed to be coming from behind the walls. The next morning, I couldn't resist anymore. I wasn't exactly handy, but I was determined to find out what was causing the noise. With a flashlight and a small toolkit, I inspected the walls in the area where I'd heard the scratching. After tapping gently and listening closely, I found a small irregularity in the drywall. I poked at it, and to my surprise, a section of the wall gave way, revealing a narrow cavity behind it. My heart raced with anticipation as I removed the drywall piece by piece. What I found was both eerie and perplexing, a message scratched into the wood framing and the back of the drywall. The words, carefully etched as if by someone who had taken their time, read, "Help me, they're watching, it's not safe." A chill ran down my spine. Who could have written this? Why was it hidden inside my wall? At first, I thought it might be some prank or random vandalism, but the message felt too serious, too deliberate, to dismiss so easily. I took photos and examined the wall more closely. The wood showed signs of age, and the drywall had clearly been patched up hastily, as if someone had tried to cover up something they didn't want found. It was clear someone had gone to great lengths to hide this message. I contacted my landlord, who seemed genuinely concerned and promised to look into it. Meanwhile, I started digging into the history of my apartment building, reaching out to previous tenants and checking with the building management for any unusual incidents or maintenance records. What I learned sent a shiver down my spine. The building had a long history, and several apartments had experienced strange occurrences. Some tenants had reported strange noises and odd disturbances, but these were always dismissed as quirks of an old building. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just an old building. I contacted the police and reported the message, requesting a full investigation. They took my concerns seriously and agreed to search the premises for any other signs of tampering or hidden messages. While waiting for their investigation, I began noticing more oddities, drafts, flickering lights, strange noises. I tried to tell myself it was just the building's age, but it only made me more uneasy. When the authorities finished their search, they found no other messages or signs of tampering. They assured me they would continue to monitor the situation, but they hadn't uncovered any immediate threats. Though the investigation didn't yield many answers, I couldn't forget what I'd found. The experience stayed with me, making me more cautious and aware of the hidden spaces in my apartment and what secrets they might hold. I never learned who wrote the message or what had happened to them, but the words, "Help me, they're watching, it's not safe," haunted me. In the end, the ordeal taught me to be more curious and mindful of the world around me and to take the time to understand the history of the places we live. Though I never discovered the full story behind the message, the experience became a part of my personal journey, shaping how I view privacy, security, and the mysteries that may lie hidden just beneath the surface. Story 2. When I decided to take a weekend getaway to a small town, I was looking forward to a peaceful retreat from my hectic life. The Airbnb listing promised a charming, modern cottage nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with glowing reviews praising the comfort and hospitality. The photos showed a cozy, well-decorated space, and I felt confident it would be the perfect escape. When I arrived, the host, a friendly middle-aged woman named Laura, greeted me with a warm smile and gave me a brief tour. The cottage was as charming as promised, with neatly arranged furniture, stylish decor, and a lovely garden, perfect for relaxing with a cup of coffee. Laura seemed genuinely kind, and I quickly felt at ease, ready to enjoy my stay. The first night went smoothly. I slept soundly, lulled by the quiet and comfort of the cottage. The next morning, I set off to explore the town, following Laura's guide to local attractions. I spent the day browsing shops, enjoying lunch at a cafe, and taking in the sights. When I returned that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. The cottage was in perfect order, but there was a slight, nagging sense of unease I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off as nerves, ready to relax for the night. The next day, I decided to do a quick check of the cottage, partly out of curiosity and partly to make sure everything was in working order. I checked the living room, kitchen appliances, and the Wi-Fi. When I got to the bedroom, I noticed something strange, a sleek modern clock on a shelf that I hadn't seen before. Upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't just a clock, it had a tiny lens embedded in its face. My heart raced as I realized what it was, a hidden camera. My mind raced as I searched other potential hiding spots. I found more cameras, behind picture frames, inside smoke detectors, and even hidden in the air conditioning vent. Each discovery made my skin crawl. I had been watched without my knowledge or consent. Feeling violated and betrayed, I took photos of the cameras and made detailed notes of their locations. I knew I had to act quickly. I contacted the local authorities, explaining the situation. The police arrived promptly and confirmed that the cameras were indeed used to record guests without their permission. It was clear that Laura had been operating a covert surveillance system. The authorities took possession of the evidence and assured me they would follow up with legal action. I also reported the incident to Airbnb, who were responsive and promised to investigate the matter thoroughly. The experience left me feeling deeply unsettled. The cottage, which had seemed like the perfect escape, became a symbol of betrayal. I had trusted Laura, a seemingly kind and welcoming host, only to discover she had been secretly watching me. It was hard to reconcile the warm hospitality I had initially experienced with the disturbing reality of her actions. In the days that followed, I received updates from both the police and Airbnb. Laura was facing legal consequences, and Airbnb promised to improve its screening processes and resources to better protect guests' privacy. This ordeal left me more vigilant, prompting me to advocate for stronger privacy protections for travelers. While it was a distressing experience, it also served as a powerful reminder of the importance of safeguarding our personal privacy in an increasingly connected world. Story 3. The day had been long and stressful, filled with endless meetings and a mountain of paperwork. As the clock ticked towards evening, I was eager to leave the office and escape the grind. Finally, I packed up my things and headed out, looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city as I walked to my car, relieved to be done with work. I started the engine and made my way home, taking my usual route through the familiar streets. The drive was uneventful, and I was lost in thought, mentally planning my evening chores and relaxing activities. But as I turned onto my street, I noticed a car behind me that had been following me for a while. It wasn't unusual to see familiar cars on this route, so I didn't think much of it. I parked in my designated spot, gathered my things from the passenger seat, and glanced at the car briefly. It parked a few spaces away. I didn't think anything of it, assuming it was just a coincidence. But as I walked towards my building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the same car idling in the lot, its engine still running. I hurried inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Once inside my apartment, I went through my usual routine, locking the door, setting down my bags, and drawing the curtains. But as I tried to relax, the sense of unease wouldn't go away. I made my way to the kitchen to prepare some tea. As I waited for the kettle, I absent-mindedly glanced out the window and froze. There, standing outside, just inches from the window, was the figure of someone I recognized. It was the same person who had been following me in the car. Panic surged through me as I ducked out of view. Someone had followed me home, and now they were watching me from outside. I grabbed my phone, dialed the local police, and explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady. The dispatcher assured me that officers would be sent immediately. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, I heard the distant sound of sirens. Relief washed over me when I saw the flashing lights of a police car outside my building. The officers arrived, conducted a thorough search of the area, and reviewed security footage from the building's cameras. Though they didn't find any conclusive evidence or identify the person, they assured me they would continue the investigation. In the days that followed, I took extra precautions, installing additional locks, setting up a security camera, and varying my routine. The experience made me acutely aware of the importance of personal security. While the immediate threat had passed, the lingering anxiety stayed with me. The police investigation continued, but I was left with a sense of vulnerability and unease, always looking over my shoulder now. Story 4. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the first letter arrived. I had just come home from work, carrying a stack of papers and my keys, when I noticed an unmarked envelope sticking out of my mailbox. The message inside was brief, written in a hurried, jagged script, and it sent a chill down my spine. You're being watched. Keep your guard up. At first, I dismissed it as a prank. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, after all, where things like this were rare, but not entirely unheard of. I tossed the letter aside and went on with my evening, telling myself it was nothing to worry about. But when the second letter arrived a week later, my unease began to grow. It was the same unmarked envelope, but this time, the note inside was far more direct. You can't hide forever. We know where you live. I considered contacting the police but hesitated. The letters were unsettling, but there was no clear threat. I decided to hold on to them, hoping that if there was any real danger, it would soon become clear. By the third letter, my anxiety was mounting. The pattern was undeniable. The letters arrived at irregular intervals, each more ominous than the last, speaking of being watched, of secrets, and of dire consequences if I didn't heed the warnings. I began checking the locks every time I left the house, always double-checking to make sure everything was secure. Things took a darker turn when I began noticing signs of intrusion. One morning, I found my front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I inspected the house. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the sense of violation was undeniable. I dismissed it as an oversight. However, over the following weeks, I discovered more disturbing signs. The back door was unlatched, and windows I knew I had closed were left ajar. It was as if someone had been entering my home just to unsettle me. Despite installing new locks and adding security measures like cameras and motion sensors, the intrusions continued. The cameras captured brief shadows and suspicious movements, but nothing concrete enough to identify the intruder. Feeling increasingly vulnerable, I began documenting everything, the times and dates of the incidents, changes to the locks, and the letters. I hoped there might be a clue or a pattern that would help me make sense of it all. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of creaking floorboards. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and checked the security footage. The cameras had captured movement, but the image was too blurry to identify anyone. Desperate for answers, I contacted a private investigator. Laura, a no-nonsense woman, took the case seriously and began her own investigation, reviewing the letters and footage, setting up additional surveillance, and interviewing my neighbors. Though the intrusions decreased during her investigation, we still couldn't identify the culprit. Then, a breakthrough came. The intruder seemed to be familiar with my security system. The way they tampered with it suggested they had a personal grudge. With this new information, Laura tracked down a lead and discovered that the intruder was a former coworker who had been fired under tense circumstances. The letters and break-ins were his way of seeking revenge and trying to scare me. The police apprehended him, and the case was resolved. While the experience was unsettling, it also provided closure. The intrusion stopped, and my home returned to a sense of peace. I remained vigilant, but the fear was now replaced with cautious relief. This ordeal taught me how easily vulnerability can be exploited and the importance of trusting your instincts and seeking help when something doesn't feel right. Story 5. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when I decided to tackle the clutter in the attic. The storm outside had forced me indoors, so I figured it was the perfect time to finally clear out some of the old boxes that had accumulated over the years. The attic had always been a mystery to me, filled with forgotten items from the past. I rarely ventured into the space, and the musty smell of old paper greeted me as I pulled down the ladder and climbed up. As I sorted through a pile of boxes, most of the items were unremarkable: old holiday decorations, stacks of yellowing newspapers, outdated electronics. But then, something unusual caught my eye: a small wooden chest at the bottom of one box, buried beneath old magazines and children's books. The chest was ornate, with intricate carvings and a heavy brass lock. I carefully pulled it out and examined it, curious about what might be inside. After struggling to open the lock with a makeshift tool, I decided to look for a key. To my surprise, I found a small brass key in a drawer filled with old trinkets and keys. My heart raced as I turned the key in the lock. It clicked open. Inside the chest was a photo album, filled with neatly stacked photographs. At first, they seemed like normal family photos, gatherings, celebrations, everyday moments. But as I flipped through the pages, the photos became increasingly disturbing. They showed pictures of my family and me in our own home, captured in moments of vulnerability. There were images of us through windows, in the backyard, even in the kitchen. It was as though someone had been watching us for an extended period, documenting our daily lives from hidden vantage points. The photos were meticulously labeled with dates and times, adding an unsettling layer of precision to the invasion of our privacy. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Someone had been intruding on our lives, capturing intimate moments without our knowledge. My hands trembled as I flipped through the album, discovering more photos taken from angles that suggested hidden cameras. Some images even captured us reacting to stressful situations, loud noises, unexpected visitors. It was clear that someone had been monitoring us, not just in ordinary moments, but in our most vulnerable ones. I closed the chest, feeling the cold weight of the discovery. The attic, once a forgotten storage space, had become a symbol of this disturbing breach into our lives. Without wasting any time, I took the chest and its contents downstairs and called the authorities. The police arrived quickly and took the evidence for further investigation. They were professional, but I could see the concern in their eyes. While waiting for answers, I took steps to ensure the safety of my family. I hired a security expert to assess our home for any hidden surveillance equipment. Thankfully, nothing else was found, but the sense of violation lingered. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued at a slow pace. The police worked on tracking down leads, but progress was minimal. The experience had a lasting impact on my sense of security. The discovery of the photographs was a harsh reminder of how vulnerable our private lives can be. While the case remained open, I had no easy answers, only a deep sense of unease and a new awareness of the length someone might go to invade our space. Story 6. Traveling alone had always been a source of comfort for me, a chance to escape the daily grind and immerse myself in new experiences. This particular trip was meant to be a peaceful break from my busy life, a week-long journey to a coastal town known for its beauty and relaxed atmosphere. Everything was going as planned until something unsettling turned my vacation into a nightmare. One crisp afternoon, I decided to explore the town's charming downtown area. The streets were lined with boutique shops, cozy cafes, and art galleries. I spent the day enjoying the galleries, sampling local food, and breathing in the fresh sea air. As the sun set, casting a golden hue over the town, I returned to my rental apartment in high spirits. I had just settled in for a quiet evening when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me, and I answered. To my shock, a series of recorded voices began to play through the speaker. The first recording was a snippet from a conversation I had earlier in the day with a barista at a local cafe. We had talked about coffee and the weather. Then, another recording played, a conversation I'd had with a shopkeeper at a boutique. The recordings continued, capturing intimate moments from my day with unnerving precision. My heart raced as I listened. Someone had been listening to my conversations and had stored them. The realization that my privacy had been so thoroughly violated was overwhelming. I ended the call abruptly, my mind racing. How was this possible? How had they done this? I immediately reported the incident to the local police. They assured me they would investigate, though tracking down the source of such recordings could be complex. For the next few days, I felt a heightened sense of paranoia. I was cautious about whom I spoke to and became acutely aware of my surroundings. Then, a few days later, I received another call. The recordings were more recent now, conversations I'd had just the day before. It became clear that the recordings were not just from earlier in my trip, but were being updated in real time. I contacted the police again, and they escalated the investigation, involving cybercrime experts to trace the source. While they continued their work, I remained vigilant, taking extra precautions with my devices and privacy. After several weeks, the authorities made progress. They traced the calls to a local business using a call forwarding service. However, the business owner was cooperative, and the recordings weren't coming from them directly. They were being routed through an intermediary. The case remained open as the investigation continued. The experience left me shaken and more aware of how vulnerable our privacy can be. While I hoped for a resolution, the intrusion remained with me, a constant reminder of the fragility of our personal boundaries in a world where everything is increasingly connected. Story 7. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I first noticed something unusual about my house. I had spent most of the previous week traveling for work and had just returned home. Everything seemed in place, but as I unpacked and settled in, I noticed a faint, musty odor in the hallway. I dismissed it as old dust and went about my usual weekend routine. A few days later, I decided to declutter the attic, a task I'd been putting off for months. The space was filled with forgotten items, old furniture, stacks of books, and boxes of seasonal decorations. As I sorted through things, I found an old, battered trunk that had been tucked away in a corner I had never noticed before. At first, it seemed like an unremarkable wooden box, but when I opened it, I was met with an assortment of strange items, food wrappers, used paper plates, and empty water bottles. There were also personal belongings, things I didn't recognize, yet felt oddly intimate, like a pair of reading glasses and a worn sweater. My heart began to race as I sorted through the contents. The food wrappers seemed fresh, despite the trunk being hidden for so long. Someone had been using this space. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been living in my attic, right under my nose. I immediately contacted the police, and an officer arrived quickly to examine the evidence. Though they took detailed notes and photographs, there were no signs of forced entry. The intruder had gained access through a small, unnoticed hatch in the master bedroom closet. Over the next few days, the police conducted a thorough search, but there were no leads. The intruder had vanished without a trace. As the investigation stalled, I took steps to secure my home, installing additional locks, reinforcing the attic hatch, and upgrading the security system. While the sense of safety slowly returned, the psychological impact of knowing someone had been living above me lingered. The memory of the intrusion remained a dark shadow, a reminder of how easily our sense of security can be shattered. The attic, once a forgotten storage space, had become a symbol of the boundaries we must protect to preserve our peace of mind. Story 8. It was a typical Saturday morning, and I was savoring a rare day off. The sun was shining, and I had planned to relax at home, catching up on some reading and maybe tackling a few household chores. I was in the middle of making coffee when I heard the doorbell ring. Expecting a delivery or a neighbor, I was surprised to see my coworker Dan standing at my doorstep when I opened the door. Dan worked in the same department as me and was a friendly enough person, though we weren't close. He was always chatty at work, but we rarely socialized outside the office. His visit was completely unexpected, and I couldn't hide my surprise. "Hey there," Dan said cheerfully. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by." I hesitated for a moment. It was an odd coincidence that he was in the area on a Saturday morning, and especially strange that he knew where I lived. But I forced a smile and invited him in, thinking it would be polite to offer him a cup of coffee. As Dan stepped inside, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes seemed to scan my home, taking in the details of my living space. We made small talk while I prepared the coffee, but I began to feel uneasy. At first, the conversation was harmless enough. Dan asked about my plans for the day and commented on a new bookshelf I had recently installed. I replied politely, but the way he knew so much about my home struck me as strange. When I mentioned that I was planning to do some gardening, Dan's interest became particularly intense. He asked detailed questions about my plants and gave unsolicited advice on soil quality and pest control. His knowledge of my hobby was spot on, but it was unsettling how familiar he was with it. Eventually, we shifted the conversation to work, and I began to relax, thinking maybe he was just trying to bond. He shared some updates on office projects and some gossip, but the nagging discomfort lingered. There was something about his visit that didn't sit right with me. When he finally left, I felt a sense of relief but also continued unease. It bothered me that he'd shown up unannounced and seemed to know so much about my daily life. I wondered if I had mentioned any of these things casually at work, but nothing felt like it would explain his detailed knowledge. The next week, I found myself replaying the encounter, trying to remember if I'd accidentally shared personal details. I became more cautious in my interactions, carefully considering what I said. My discomfort grew, so I decided to confide in Maria, a close friend who worked in the company's HR department. Maria listened intently and agreed that the situation was odd. She advised me to document any other incidents that made me uncomfortable, in case things escalated. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to Dan's behavior. Though he continued to be friendly, there were moments when his comments seemed too informed, like mentioning seeing me at the gym or commenting on my weekend plans. It started to feel like he was tracking my every move. Feeling more and more uneasy, I approached Maria again with a detailed account of Dan's behavior. She took my concerns seriously and said she would look into the matter. The company had policies in place to address privacy violations, and it was important to ensure everyone's personal space was respected. The following week, Maria told me she'd spoken to Dan about the situation. He claimed his visit was purely coincidental and that he hadn't intended to make me uncomfortable. Though the company had addressed it, there was no concrete evidence to suggest any wrongdoing. I continued to be cautious around him, though, and maintained firm boundaries at work. In the months that followed, things seemed to settle. Dan remained a friendly coworker, but our interactions stayed professional. The experience, however, left me more aware of the importance of boundaries and protecting my privacy, both at work and outside of it. It served as a reminder of how easily personal space can be violated and how essential it is to maintain clear boundaries. Story 9. The first signs that something was wrong were subtle, almost imperceptible. It was a crisp, sunny Saturday when I first noticed it. I was at the local farmer's market, enjoying the lively atmosphere and sampling fresh produce. As I was selecting ripe tomatoes, a stranger approached me and casually asked if I was still working at the job I had recently mentioned to a mutual friend. I was taken aback. Only a close friend knew about my new job, not anyone else. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. Maybe the stranger had overheard my conversation or simply knew a lot about the local community. But as the days went by, the pattern continued. I began receiving unsolicited messages from unfamiliar numbers, referencing personal details about my life, like my favorite coffee shop, the gym I attended, and even the name of my dog. Each message was eerily accurate, containing information that wasn't publicly available. The situation escalated quickly. My private social media accounts began receiving odd friend requests and messages from strangers. These messages referenced my daily routine, places I frequented, and even snippets of conversations I'd had with friends. It felt like someone was meticulously tracking my every move, but their identity remained a mystery. Then the invasion of privacy reached new heights. I started receiving packages at home, items that seemed random but were bizarrely tailored to my tastes. Books I had mentioned wanting to read, clothes in my favorite colors, and specialty foods I had once casually mentioned. It was as though someone had a detailed dossier on my preferences and was using it to taunt me. I reported the incidents to the authorities, but their investigations yielded little. The packages were sent from various locations, and the messages were routed through anonymous accounts or disposable phones. The police were sympathetic but frustrated, unable to trace the source. My sense of security began to unravel. I became paranoid, constantly checking my surroundings, avoiding places I usually visited. Every unfamiliar face made me uneasy. I started altering my routines, taking different routes to work, and avoiding predictable patterns. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being watched persisted. One evening, I returned home to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I cautiously entered, half expecting to find an intruder inside. Fortunately, the house was empty, and nothing seemed out of place, but the door being open was enough to set off alarm bells. I had no memory of leaving it that way, and the thought that someone had been inside was deeply unsettling. As time went on, the stalking became more sophisticated. I began noticing strange signs that someone was monitoring my digital life. My email account started receiving spam messages that contained references to personal details, passwords, old addresses, even names of family members. Someone had gained access to my information and was using it to invade my privacy further. Determined to regain control, I took extensive measures to secure my online presence. I updated all my passwords, enabled two-factor authentication, and enlisted the help of a cybersecurity expert to ensure my accounts were secure. I also started using encryption for sensitive communications and became more cautious about sharing personal details online. Despite these efforts, the stalker's methods evolved. I began receiving anonymous phone calls, sometimes silence on the other end, other times faint whispers that sent chills down my spine. It was clear that this person was relentless and resourceful, using every means possible to monitor and intrude into my life. The psychological toll was immense. The constant fear and anxiety wore me down. I found it difficult to trust people, becoming increasingly isolated. My once comfortable sanctuary now felt like a prison, and the sense of being constantly surveilled eroded my sense of security. I continued working with the authorities, providing them with every piece of evidence I could. I also hired private investigators who specialized in stalking cases, hoping for a fresh perspective. Yet, despite their efforts, the identity of the stalker remained elusive. Then, one day, while reviewing old records, I stumbled upon a pattern. The stalker's actions seemed to correlate with certain events or places I frequented. It wasn't random, it suggested a deeper understanding of my habits. This discovery was both chilling and enlightening, as it meant the stalker wasn't just monitoring me by chance, they had a more intimate knowledge of my activities. Determined to protect myself, I made significant changes to my life. I relocated to a new home under a new identity, taking every precaution to ensure my new address and details remained confidential. I also sought therapy to cope with the emotional aftermath of the stalking. Though the stalking eventually subsided, the experience left an indelible mark on me. It taught me valuable lessons about personal safety, privacy, and resilience in the face of persistent threats. The stalker's identity remains a mystery, but the impact of their actions will stay with me forever. I learned to be vigilant, understanding that there are darker aspects of human behavior that can invade our lives in ways we can't always predict or control. Story 10. Moving into a new apartment always felt like a chance for a fresh start. The city was lively, full of opportunities, and my new one-bedroom apartment was nestled in an older building that had a lot of character. I was eager to make it my own, to turn it into a cozy haven away from the bustle of daily life. The moving process was exhausting but exciting, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and adjusting to the rhythm of my new home. The apartment had a modest charm with hardwood floors and classic molding. The bedroom closet was spacious, which was a relief, offering ample storage. One afternoon, as I was putting away some clothes, I noticed something unusual tucked away behind a stack of old shoe boxes. It was a small leather-bound diary, wedged in the back corner, partially hidden by dust-covered boxes. My curiosity got the better of me, so I reached for it, brushing off the dust. The smooth leather felt worn but still intact. The diary had no identifying marks, just a simple brass clasp holding it shut. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was invading someone's privacy, but I couldn't resist opening it. The pages were dated, written in neat script, and detailed a range of personal experiences, from mundane daily activities to deeper reflections. It was clear that the diary belonged to the previous tenant, a woman named Eleanor. As I read, I got a glimpse into Eleanor's life, her struggles, dreams, and the emotional ups and downs she had experienced while living in the apartment. One entry stood out, detailing a particularly difficult day when she had gone through a breakup. Her raw words about betrayal were so personal that I almost felt like I was reading a letter meant for someone else. Another entry revealed her secret passion for writing. She had been working on a novel in her spare time, and I could feel her excitement when she wrote about overcoming writer's block and finishing a chapter. The more I read, the more I realized Eleanor was searching for something more in life. She was dissatisfied with her job and yearned for adventure, deeper connections, and fulfillment. But then I came across an entry that stopped me cold. She wrote about someone who had been following her, someone who was watching her and causing her distress. She didn't give many details, but the fear in her words was palpable. The thought that someone had been watching her made me wonder why Eleanor had left. Had she found the answers she was seeking, or did she simply move on, leaving everything behind, including the diary? I decided to look into the building's history. The landlord, an elderly man who had managed the building for years, remembered Eleanor vaguely. He said she was quiet and kept to herself, and that she had left abruptly, leaving behind many of her belongings, including the diary. With the diary in hand, I felt a responsibility to understand Eleanor's story better, but I couldn't find any way to contact her. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. As I continued to read, I started to see traces of Eleanor's presence in the apartment, her choice of furniture, the way she had decorated the space. It was as if her life had left an imprint on the very walls. One evening, as I was reflecting on the diary, there was a knock at the door. To my surprise, it was Eleanor's sister, who had come to collect some of her belongings. After a brief hesitation, I decided to return the diary to her family. Her sister was moved and grateful, and as she read through the entries, she shared that Eleanor had, in fact, moved to another city in search of new opportunities and a fresh start. The diary, it seemed, had been an important part of her journey, and returning it brought a sense of closure to her family. Though finding the diary had been an unexpected and somewhat unsettling experience, it ultimately allowed me to understand Eleanor's search for meaning. It also reminded me of the importance of respecting the stories and lives that have shaped the places we inhabit. As I continued to make the apartment my own, I carried with me a deeper appreciation for the past, and for the connections we share, even with those we never truly meet. Story 11. The phone call started like any other on an ordinary Tuesday evening. It was a quiet night. I had just settled in with a book and a cup of tea, expecting nothing more than a relaxing evening. But then the phone rang. It was an old-fashioned landline, the kind I kept for its reliability, and the sound of it breaking the silence was jarring. I picked it up, half expecting it to be a telemarketer or wrong number. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then a voice crackled through the receiver, soft, muffled, and unfamiliar, but with a strange sense of familiarity. I assumed it was a bad connection and hung up, dismissing it as nothing more than a glitch. But the next night, the phone rang again. This time, the voice was clearer, though still distorted. It sounded eerily like my niece's, though the tone was high-pitched and indecipherable. I couldn't understand why someone would mimic a child's voice, and a chill ran down my spine as I hung up, feeling unnerved. Over the next few weeks, the calls continued, each more disturbing than the last. The voices became more specific, mimicking the sounds of my close family and friends. I heard my mother's voice, though the words were garbled and unintelligible. My best friend's voice followed, full of laughter but distorted beyond recognition. It was always the same, snippets of familiar voices, but no actual communication. Each call left me on edge, unsure whether the person on the other end was trying to send a message or simply torment me. I started to consider that these calls weren't random. The persistence and eerie accuracy of the voices made me think someone was deliberately targeting me. I decided to take action and began recording the calls, hoping to analyze them for clues. Each recording was the same, familiar voices, distorted, but never direct. It felt like the caller was using my loved ones' voices to invade my personal space. I reached out to my family and friends, hoping to find some explanation. They hadn't experienced anything unusual themselves, but we speculated that the calls could be the work of someone using sophisticated voice manipulation technology. None of the theories provided comfort, though. The calls became a nightly ritual, often happening just before I was about to fall asleep. The consistency of the timing made it feel deliberate, as if someone knew my routine and was using it to unsettle me. Eventually, I decided to contact the authorities, providing them with the recordings and a detailed account of the calls. They were sympathetic but explained that without more concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I continue documenting the calls and consider installing additional security measures. Despite their advice, I felt increasingly helpless. The calls disrupted my sleep, clouded my thoughts, and left me dreading each night, each call a reminder of the persistent anxiety that haunted me. Then one night, as I was listening to another disturbing call, I noticed something odd. At the end of the call, I heard a faint click, almost as though the line had been disconnected, not by me, but by the caller. It was a small detail, but it suggested the calls were coming from somewhere nearby. With this new realization, I started to investigate the neighborhood, watching for anyone who seemed out of place. I kept a log of dates and times, hoping to uncover any leads. After weeks of vigilance, I finally noticed a pattern. One of the building's maintenance workers seemed to be present whenever the calls occurred, and he had access to the building's telephone system. When I confronted him, he initially denied everything, but eventually, he confessed. He had been using a sophisticated device to mimic voices and disturb me, hoping to drive me away so he could access apartments for petty theft. The discovery brought both relief and further violation. The maintenance worker was arrested, and the calls stopped. But the psychological toll remained. The experience served as a stark reminder of how easily one's sense of security can be shattered, and how trust and vigilance must go hand in hand. Though the immediate threat was gone, the sense of being watched and manipulated left a lasting impact on me, a constant reminder of the vulnerabilities we face in our daily lives. Story 12. It began on a chilly November morning. A small, plain box appeared on my doorstep, nearly blending in with the usual clutter of junk mail and packages. Wrapped in brown paper, it had no markings or labels. My curiosity piqued, but I quickly dismissed it as either a misdelivered package or a gift from a friend who forgot to include a note. I brought it inside and carefully opened it, only to find a photograph of myself, taken from a distance during a recent outing at the park. I was startled, but tried to brush it off as a strange coincidence, maybe even a prank. I searched the box again, hoping to find a note or some clue about who had sent it, but there was nothing. No name, no address, just the unsettling image. In the following days, more packages arrived. Each one was similar, unmarked boxes containing increasingly disturbing items. One package held a handwritten note that mentioned details of a recent trip to a nearby city, including a cafe I had visited and the clothes I had worn. Another box contained faded receipts from a store I frequented, including some I had forgotten about. The most unsettling package came one evening while I was cooking dinner. It contained a small bundle of items from my trash, an old grocery receipt, a crumpled ticket stub, and an empty envelope with my name and address on it. It was clear someone had been rifling through my garbage, collecting personal information. I felt a rising sense of dread and paranoia, unsure of who could be targeting me or why. The packages kept coming, each one more invasive than the last: copies of personal letters, snippets of private conversations, even a lock of hair that seemed to have been cut from a brush I had used. It became clear that someone wasn't just observing my life, they were deliberately intruding into my private space. Desperate, I contacted the local authorities. They took the matter seriously, and an officer came to collect the packages and examine the evidence. They assured me they would investigate and try to identify the sender. Meanwhile, they advised me to be vigilant and report any further suspicious activity. I took extra precautions, installing additional locks, security cameras, and motion-activated lights around my home. But no matter what I did, the sense of violation lingered. The investigation revealed that the packages had been sent from different locations, making it difficult to trace the sender. The authorities suspected the person was using fake addresses or stolen identities to cover their tracks. As the days passed, the packages stopped, but the fear and anxiety remained. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, second-guessing every interaction and constantly looking over my shoulder. Then, the anonymous phone calls started, silent, brief calls in the middle of the night. The authorities traced them to a payphone several miles away, but the person remained elusive. Eventually, the packages stopped arriving, and the calls ceased. The police were unable to identify the person or determine their motives. The investigation remained open, but with few leads, progress was slow. The experience left me deeply shaken. The comfort of my home became a source of fear and anxiety. The sense of invasion into my private life was profound, and I struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. I found solace in talking to friends and family, who offered support. This incident made me more aware of the importance of privacy and security, prompting me to take greater control over my personal information and take steps to protect my home. I even sought therapy to process the trauma. While the identity of the sender remained a mystery, the ordeal taught me a harsh lesson about the vulnerabilities we face in an increasingly connected world. It also strengthened my resolve to safeguard my personal space from future intrusions. Story 13. It all started subtly, small, almost imperceptible changes in my financial accounts. A few discrepancies, unrecognized charges, and unfamiliar transactions. At first, I dismissed them as minor errors, a result of my own occasional lapses in attention. But then, the unease turned into fear. It began with a phone call. I was at home on a lazy Saturday afternoon when my phone rang. An automated voice informed me that my credit card had been flagged for suspicious activity. Panicked, I called my bank. They assured me they would investigate and issued me a new card. It was a routine security measure, they said. But this was just the beginning of something much darker. A few days later, the first threatening message arrived. It came from an unknown number, and its content was chilling. It referenced my recent financial troubles and included details only someone with access to my personal information could know. I know about your bank account. If you don't cooperate, things could get worse. At first, I thought it was just a phishing attempt or a scam. Who would risk everything to send such menacing messages? But the messages didn't stop. They became more frequent, more detailed. Each one seemed to unveil more personal information, my home address, my workplace, even my upcoming travel plans. It was like someone was piecing together my entire life. And with each message, the threats grew more alarming. Panic set in as I realized my identity had been stolen. I scrambled to secure my accounts, changing passwords, alerting financial institutions, and placing fraud alerts on my credit reports. I even contacted the police to report the theft. But no matter what I did, the messages kept coming. They escalated in both frequency and intensity. One particularly terrifying message described a conversation I had supposedly had with a colleague, a conversation that never happened, yet was eerily accurate in its details. "You should be careful," it warned. "Your secrets are not as safe as you think." It felt like someone was watching me, tracking my every move. I installed security cameras, motion sensors, and varied my routines to avoid being predictable. But no matter how careful I was, the sense of dread never fully dissipated. It was suffocating. The police were investigating, but progress was slow. The anonymous nature of the messages made it hard to trace their origin. Each day felt like a waiting game, my anxiety growing as I waited for answers. In the midst of all this, I found some comfort in the support of friends and family. They expressed concern and empathy, but I struggled to share the full extent of my fear with them. I didn't want to burden them, even though I relied on their emotional support. At work, things became increasingly challenging. The stress took a toll on my ability to focus, and I struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy while dealing with the fear that someone was actively targeting me. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, there was a breakthrough. The police identified patterns that led them to a suspect, someone with a history of similar crimes. They made an arrest, and I felt a sense of relief. The authorities assured me the investigation would continue and that they were working to recover stolen information and prevent further breaches. But even after the arrest, I still had to deal with the damage done to my credit and identity. It was a long, exhausting process, filled with paperwork and countless follow-ups. Yet, as the legal process unfolded, there was a sense of closure. The suspect was charged with identity theft and related crimes, but the emotional scars remained. The experience had forever changed my sense of safety and trust. I became much more vigilant about my personal security and began advocating for digital privacy. I worked closely with financial institutions to monitor my accounts and remained in contact with the police to stay updated on the case. Though the immediate danger had passed, the psychological impact lingered. Simple tasks like answering phone calls or checking emails now carried an added layer of anxiety. Over time, I began to rebuild my sense of normalcy. I attended counseling to address the emotional toll the experience had taken on me. The process was slow, but I found solace in knowing I wasn't alone. Many others had faced similar challenges and emerged stronger. In the end, the ordeal taught me resilience, and through the support of loved ones and the efforts of law enforcement, I managed to regain control of my life. Story 14. It all began on a typical Tuesday morning when I noticed something odd with my phone. The battery seemed to be draining much faster than usual, and there were strange spikes in my data usage. At first, I assumed it was just a glitch or maybe an app update. But then, I started receiving weird notifications and targeted ads for places I had recently visited, and that's when I started to worry. I initially thought an app one had downloaded might be the culprit, so I decided to investigate further. I carefully reviewed all the apps installed on my phone. Most of them were familiar, but I made sure to check the permissions for each one. That's when I discovered an app one didn't recognize, something innocuous sounding like Weather Tracker or Health Monitor. However, it had extensive access to my location and personal data. I tried to delete the app immediately, but a message popped up warning that removing it could cause unintended consequences. That alarmed me. I had never experienced anything like this before, and it became clear that something far more sinister was at play. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I started researching the app online. To my horror, I found that it was a well-known tool used for covert surveillance, designed to track and monitor users without their consent. I was stunned. Every move I had made was being tracked and recorded by someone who had unauthorized access to my phone. I knew I needed help, so I reached out to a cybersecurity expert named Mark, who came highly recommended. I explained the situation, and he agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Mark arrived at my apartment with a set of diagnostic tools, and he immediately began running scans on my phone. After a careful analysis, he confirmed my worst fears. The app had been logging my exact movements for weeks, tracking locations I had visited, places I frequented, and even sensitive details about my daily routine. He was able to trace the app's origin and discovered that it had been installed through a mix of phishing tactics and social engineering. The app had been disguised as something legitimate, tricking me into granting it access to my location and personal data. Next, Mark worked meticulously to remove the app and secure my phone. He installed advanced security measures to prevent future breaches and gave me advice on best practices to protect my digital privacy. Throughout the process, Mark explained how widespread and sophisticated modern surveillance methods could be. Some tracking apps are used for legitimate purposes, like parental control or employee monitoring, but others are far more nefarious. Once the app was gone and my phone was secure, I reflected on the violation of my privacy. The knowledge that my every move had been watched made me feel vulnerable and exposed. I started to consider who might have had access to my phone and why they would target me. I took the evidence Mark had gathered to the police, and they took it seriously, launching an investigation into the perpetrator. It wasn't long before they traced the app's distribution network and identified a suspect, a former acquaintance I had a falling out with months earlier. This person, apparently holding a grudge, had used the app to invade my privacy. The case was complex, and the legal process took time, but eventually, the suspect was charged with unauthorized surveillance and invasion of privacy. While the experience was unsettling, it reminded me of the delicate balance between technology's benefits and its potential for harm. I became much more vigilant about my digital security. I reviewed my app permissions, strengthened security settings, and educated myself on cybersecurity best practices. I even became an advocate for digital privacy, sharing what I had learned with my friends and family. Though I still felt the sting of the violation, I found some closure in knowing that my privacy had been restored and that steps were being taken to hold the responsible party accountable. This experience had a lasting impact on me, reinforcing the importance of being cautious and proactive about protecting personal information in an increasingly connected world. Story 15. It started on an ordinary Thursday. I had been meaning to clean out the clutter in the basement for months, and finally, I had an afternoon free. The basement was a space that didn't get much use beyond storage. It was large, a bit damp, with exposed wooden beams and concrete walls. Over the years, it had become a catch-all for old furniture, seasonal decorations, and forgotten boxes. As I descended the creaky stairs, I was greeted by a familiar, musty smell mixed with a faint hint of mildew. I flipped on the single overhead light, which flickered before settling into a dim, uneven glow. I began sorting through a stack of boxes filled with old books and knickknacks. But soon, I felt compelled to clear out a particularly cluttered corner. It was there, hidden behind an old wardrobe and a pile of photo albums, that I found something unusual. Partially obscured by dust and cobwebs, there was a large, heavy box. It was made of sturdy cardboard and had clearly been shoved into the corner carelessly. Curious, I dragged it out and opened it. Inside was a collection of rolled-up drawings and sketches, all neatly organized. At first glance, they seemed like architectural plans or old renovation sketches of the house. But as I unrolled more of them, I grew increasingly unsettled. The drawings weren't just about the layout of the house, they detailed everything with unnerving accuracy. Locations of furniture, personal items, and even the positioning of family photographs on the walls were meticulously documented. It felt as though someone had mapped out every corner of our home. But what was even more disturbing were the drawings of my family, sketched in startling detail. The artist had captured us in various daily activities, eating dinner, watching TV, even sleeping. Each sketch was rendered realistically, showing not just our physical likenesses but our expressions and movements. It was clear that the artist had been watching us for a long time, documenting our lives with frightening precision. In the bottom of the box, I found a tattered journal. Hesitant, I opened it. The journal was filled with handwritten notes detailing our daily routines, our interactions, and the artist's observations. The entries were dated and written with a disturbing level of detail. The journal revealed that someone had been living in the basement, observing us from the shadows. The artist had made secret modifications to the basement to make it habitable, adding insulation, setting up a makeshift bed, and creating hidden compartments for their belongings. It was clear that they had been living there, undetected, for some time, silently watching us. My heart raced as I read through the journal. The violation felt overwhelming. The basement, once just a forgotten storage space, had been transformed into a hidden lair. The artist had even detailed how they would emerge only at night, when the house was quiet, to avoid detection. I knew I had to act quickly. I called the authorities, explaining the situation and showing them the drawings and journal. The police arrived promptly and began their investigation. They searched the basement thoroughly, finding hidden compartments and inconspicuous hiding spots, but no sign of the intruder. The police took the evidence for further analysis and promised to investigate. Given the complexity of the case, they warned me that answers might not come easily. Meanwhile, I took extra precautions to ensure the safety of my family, adding more security cameras and alarms around our home. The whole experience left me with a deep sense of unease. The knowledge that someone had been living in our basement, watching our every move, was deeply disturbing. It made me feel like our home, once a sanctuary, had been violated. Weeks passed, and the investigation continued, but the trail grew cold. The police believed the intruder had fled, leaving only the drawings and journal behind. Though the immediate threat was gone, the psychological impact lingered. The basement had gone from being a forgotten storage space to a chilling reminder of the invasion. Despite the steps we had taken to improve our security, the memory of the hidden compartment and the detailed drawings haunted us. It was a sobering reminder of the lengths to which someone would go to invade our privacy. The experience made me more vigilant and aware of the hidden threats that might be lurking in the most unexpected places. Story 16. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friend Sarah first confided in me about her growing unease. We had been close for years, sharing everything from triumphs to troubles, so when she told me she was feeling followed, I immediately grew concerned. Sarah had always been perceptive, and if she said someone was tailing her, I knew it was worth taking seriously. She first mentioned it during a casual phone call, describing how for several days she had noticed a figure following her. The person never got close enough to identify, but their presence was constant. They would appear just as she left work or walked her dog in the evening. No matter how she tried to confront them, the figure always disappeared into the crowd. I tried to reassure her that it was probably her imagination playing tricks, but I could hear the tension in her voice. Sarah's usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced with a deep sense of anxiety. She mentioned considering changing her daily routines or even moving temporarily to feel safe, but she wasn't sure it would help. A few days later, I received a panicked call from Sarah. Her voice was trembling as she told me that the situation had escalated. The figure had been bolder this time, getting close enough for her to glimpse their face before disappearing. She was terrified, feeling as though she were trapped in a thriller that she couldn't escape. When I arrived at her apartment, I could feel the sense of dread in the air. Her normally tidy home was in disarray, papers scattered, drawers left open, and furniture moved. Sarah met me at the door, her eyes swollen from crying, and led me inside. She was visibly shaken. "I feel like I'm being watched all the time," she said, her voice cracking. "It's like someone knows my every move." We decided to search her apartment, hoping to find something that might explain her fears. We checked her front door and windows to ensure they were secure. Then, in her bedroom, I found something that made my stomach drop. Hidden behind a row of coats in her closet was a small, inconspicuous box. Inside, I found photographs of Sarah, taken at various locations around the city, from different angles, and at different times of day. The photos were clearly taken without her knowledge, showing that someone had been following her for some time. Along with the photos were handwritten notes, detailing her routines, the times she left for work, her favorite spots, and even the names of some of her friends. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Sarah had been under surveillance, and someone had been watching her every move. The sense of violation was overwhelming, and I could see the terror in her eyes. We took the photographs and notes to the police. They were concerned but cautious, promising to investigate the situation. They suggested Sarah increase her security and be mindful of her routines. They also advised against making sudden changes that might alert the person following her. In the days that followed, Sarah became increasingly reclusive, avoiding places she frequented and staying home as much as possible. The constant fear of being watched began to take a toll on her mental health, and I did my best to support her, but I could see it was far beyond simple reassurance. The police investigation continued, but progress was slow. They canvassed the area around Sarah's home and searched her apartment for additional evidence. However, the identity of the person following her remained a mystery. Despite the lack of answers, Sarah's vigilance remained heightened. She installed security cameras around her home and took steps to protect her online presence. The experience left both of us with a lasting understanding of the vulnerability we face in a world where privacy can so easily be violated. The mystery of who had been following Sarah was never solved, but the strength and resilience she showed throughout the ordeal were a testament to her courage. For me, it served as a sobering reminder of how easily our lives can be disrupted by the intrusion of others. Story 17. Returning home after a week-long vacation was always a bittersweet experience. There was the joy of being back in familiar surroundings, but also the task of laundry and unpacking that awaited. The drive home had been pleasant enough, with the sun setting beautifully as I pulled into my driveway. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and entered the house, expecting the usual quiet. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The comforting hum of my refrigerator, which usually greeted me, was absent. My house, always filled with the soft purr of the AC or the distant creak of floorboards, felt eerily still. I dropped my bags in the foyer and began to look around. The layout of my living room seemed wrong. The sofa was where the coffee table should be, and the armchair was in a completely different corner. As I moved through the house, I discovered that every room had been similarly altered. The dining room was no exception. Chairs were stacked haphazardly, and the dining table had been pushed against the wall. Even my kitchen was off. Dishes were piled in strange formations on the counter, and utensils were arranged in ways that made no sense. It looked like someone had carefully rearranged everything, yet there was no mess or disorder. Despite the unsettling changes, nothing seemed missing. My valuables and personal items were all there, and there were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were securely locked, with no broken locks or damaged frames. It was as though someone had been in my home, moved everything around, and left without leaving a trace. The absence of any clear signs of a break-in only added to the eerie atmosphere. I contacted the police and reported what I had found. An officer arrived soon after, taking photographs of the rearranged rooms and noting the strange state of the house. While the officer was polite, they were just as puzzled as I was. There were no clear leads, and they suggested I check my security footage. When I reviewed the footage, I found nothing out of the ordinary. The cameras had recorded normal activity outside the house, but there were no signs of anyone entering. This lack of footage only deepened the mystery. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The rearranged rooms served as a constant reminder of the invasion of my privacy. I worked to put everything back the way it was, but the sense of violation lingered. I asked neighbors and friends if they had noticed anything unusual, but no one had seen or heard anything. Though the discomfort gradually faded with time, it never fully disappeared. I took steps to secure my home, including installing advanced alarm systems and motion sensors. The experience left me with a heightened awareness of how easily our sense of security can be disrupted. The rearranged house became a symbol of the fine line between safety and intrusion, a reminder to stay vigilant in an unpredictable world. Story 18. It was an ordinary morning, and I was making my way out of bed, eager to start my usual routine with a cup of coffee. The first rays of sunlight were filtering through the curtains when I shuffled into the bathroom. But as I reached for the light switch, a strange feeling of unease crept over me. I tried to shake it off as remnants of a bad dream. When I turned on the bathroom light, I froze. Across the mirror, in bold crimson-red lipstick, was a message that took my breath away. The letters were large and hastily scrawled, stark against the white surface. It read, "I see you, and I know everything, your plans, your fears, your secrets." My heart raced, and I stood there, numb. The words seemed to echo in my mind, reverberating through the bathroom tiles. I scanned the message again, my eyes darting over the letters, trying to will them away. This wasn't just some random prank, it felt deeply personal and unsettlingly precise. The lipstick was a shade I didn't recognize, and I didn't even own that kind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I had never had issues with stalkers or threats before, so why would someone target me? I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I snapped pictures of the message, wanting to document it in case I needed to show the authorities. I then texted my closest friend, Laura, explaining what I had found and asking if we could meet up. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me process this bizarre situation. When Laura arrived, she was visibly concerned. After seeing the photos and the cleaned mirror, she immediately suggested we contact the police. It seemed like a sensible idea, but I hesitated. I didn't want to appear alarmist. However, the gravity of the message made it impossible to ignore. Together, we went to the police station, where an officer listened carefully to our report. They promised to investigate and said they would increase patrols in the area. Back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My house, which used to feel like a safe space, now felt tainted by the recent invasion of privacy. I started questioning everything. Who could have been watching me? Was someone following me or spying on my routine? The following days were filled with anxiety. The police kept in touch, but there were no new developments. I took extra precautions to secure my home, changing the locks, installing more security cameras, and making sure all the doors and windows were locked. Despite these measures, I still felt uneasy, as though someone was always watching. Then, one afternoon, I found a new note slipped under my front door. The handwriting was different, but the message was eerily similar: "You can't hide. I know what you're doing." My heart raced as I read it. Someone was still intruding into my life, still watching me. I showed it to the police, but once again, there were no immediate leads. The combination of these unsettling events left me on edge, hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the sense of vulnerability never fully disappeared. It had changed the way I viewed privacy and security. I became constantly reminded that the familiar could quickly turn into something unsettling and unfamiliar. Story 19. It was a crisp autumn day when I decided it was time to hire a new babysitter for my 2 children. Juggling a demanding job and family life meant finding someone trustworthy was always my top priority. After a thorough search and several interviews, I finally felt confident in my decision. Emily, a young woman with glowing references and a warm demeanor, seemed like the perfect fit. She had an impressive background in child care and came highly recommended by a close friend who had recently moved away. The first few days with Emily went smoothly. My kids, Sarah and Max, warmed to her immediately. They would excitedly chat about their day with her when I got home, and the house always felt lighter when she was around. Emily was punctual, attentive, and seemed genuinely invested in their well-being, just as I had hoped. However, a few weeks into Emily's time with us, I began to notice small things that didn't quite sit right. It started with subtle shifts in Sarah's and Max's behavior. They became more withdrawn and hesitant to talk about their time with Emily. At first, I thought it was just an adjustment phase, but as time passed, their behavior became more concerning. My gut instinct told me something wasn't right. After a particularly chaotic day at work, I decided to install a security camera in the living room. I wasn't doing it out of distrust but more for peace of mind, just to ensure our home was secure. I installed a discreet, high-resolution camera that could be monitored remotely, setting it up without any fanfare. Over the next few days, I rarely checked the footage, mostly just ensuring it was working properly. It wasn't until I had an unexpected day off and found myself at home that I decided to review some of the footage more closely. With a cup of coffee in hand, I began scrolling through the recordings. At first, everything seemed normal, Emily playing with the kids, helping with their homework, and generally engaging with them. But as I watched more closely, I started to notice something unsettling. There were moments when Emily was alone with the children, and her tone of voice seemed off. She would say things like, "You should always listen to me. I know what's best for you," or, "If you don't behave, there will be consequences." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. There was an undertone of manipulation, something that immediately raised alarms for me. My heart pounded as I watched these interactions grow more concerning. The most alarming footage was from a weekend afternoon when Emily had taken Sarah and Max to the living room for a storytelling session. Instead of telling fun or friendly stories, she spoke to them about the importance of keeping secrets from their parents and about being careful about whom they trust. Her tone was eerily serious, and it felt wrong. I replayed the footage several times, trying to convince myself that I was misinterpreting it, but the more I watched, the more certain I became that something was deeply wrong. I immediately felt a strong need to act, but I knew I had to be cautious. I didn't want to cause a confrontation or scare the kids unnecessarily, so I decided to confront Emily in a calm, non-accusatory way. I called her and asked to meet the next day for a casual conversation about how things were going. She agreed, and we set a time for the following afternoon. In the meantime, I arranged for Sarah and Max to spend the day with a trusted friend to ensure they were safe and away from the situation. When Emily arrived, I remained calm but firm. I explained that I had installed a security camera for safety reasons and mentioned that I had reviewed some footage. At first, Emily seemed surprised, but as I pointed out the specific incidents I had observed, her demeanor shifted. She became defensive and evasive, offering vague explanations that did little to reassure me. I knew then that I couldn't continue with her services. I thanked her for her time and let her know that her employment was being terminated effective immediately. Emily's expression shifted to one of frustration, tinged with fear, but she didn't protest. I escorted her out of the house, making sure she left without incident. Afterward, I took steps to secure our home and ensure that Sarah and Max felt safe again. I sought professional help to help them process the experience and to address any concerns they might have had. It was vital to reassure them that they were safe and that their feelings were taken seriously. This experience was a harsh reminder of the importance of trusting your instincts and being vigilant. The breach of trust with Emily was deeply unsettling, but the steps I took to protect my children helped restore a sense of security. What had started as a simple measure for peace of mind, the security camera, ended up being a crucial tool in uncovering the unsettling truth about someone I had trusted with my children's care. Story 20. It was just another ordinary evening when I arrived home after work, feeling the usual exhaustion settle in. As I made my way to the front door, I noticed a small, unmarked package sitting on my doorstep. It was a plain brown box with no return address, only my name and the delivery address scribbled on the side. My curiosity piqued, but I figured it was probably just another of the many online orders I had recently placed. I brought the box inside and set it down on the kitchen counter. The lack of a return address struck me as odd, but I decided to open it anyway. I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut through the tape. Inside, I found a black cassette tape and a small handwritten note. The note was brief, scrawled in hurried handwriting, "Listen carefully." My heart skipped a beat. The cassette tape was an old, outdated format. I didn't even own a cassette player anymore, which made the situation even stranger. My first thought was to go to my neighbor, Mr. Thompson, who was a bit of a tech enthusiast and might still have an old player lying around. He greeted me warmly when I knocked on his door and, after hearing my request, rummaged through his storage closet to find an old cassette player. Back in my apartment, I set up the player, inserted the tape, and sat down on the couch, my mind racing. The mechanical whirring of the player filled the silence as the tape began to play. At first, I heard nothing but static, but soon, a familiar voice began to speak. I froze in shock. It was my own voice. The recording began innocuously enough, with me speaking in a calm, almost detached tone, reflecting on the usual day-to-day events. But as the tape went on, it took a darker turn. The voice began articulating my deepest fears and anxieties, losing loved ones, the uncertainty of the future, and a profound sense of isolation. It was as if someone had been watching me closely, picking up on my most intimate thoughts and fears. My heart raced as the voice continued, recounting specific events from my life, moments of vulnerability I had never shared with anyone. This tape was more than just a creepy recording, it felt like a direct invasion of my mind. The realization hit me hard, someone had been watching me, monitoring my every move and thought. When the tape finally ended, I was shaken. I ejected it, staring at the cassette in disbelief. Who could have made this recording? And why would they send it to me? The note gave no clues, and the lack of a return address meant I couldn't trace its origins. I called the police, who arrived promptly and took the tape for further analysis. They promised to investigate but, like me, were baffled by the entire situation. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of my eye, felt like it was someone lurking just beyond my awareness. I tried to piece together any possible clues. Who could have had access to such personal information about me? Friends and family were supportive but puzzled by my paranoia. The police investigation dragged on without any significant leads. They couldn't find anything on the tape or trace its origins. Weeks passed, and the sense of unease never left. I took steps to protect my privacy more diligently, installing new locks, security cameras, and changing my routines. But despite these precautions, the memory of that tape and the unsettling realization that someone had been watching me from the shadows stayed with me. The mystery remains unsolved, but the experience serves as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable our privacy can be in an increasingly intrusive world. Story 21. It was a typical Wednesday evening when I first noticed something strange about my car. I had just wrapped up a long day at work and was eager to get home. As I approached my car, I felt the driver's side door was unusually heavy, almost like it had been tampered with. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my tiredness. Once inside, I began adjusting my seat and mirrors, when something caught my eye. Amidst the usual clutter, I saw a small device wedged between the seat and center console. It was a compact voice recorder, one commonly used for interviews or personal notes. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't placed it there. With trembling hands, I picked it up and examined it. It was an older model with a small display and buttons I didn't recognize. I pressed play and froze in horror as I heard my own voice, my conversations and movements recorded while I had been driving. The recording was unsettling, capturing mundane chats, phone calls, and even my inner thoughts while I navigated traffic. But what really shook me was the realization that someone had been listening to me. Who could have planted it there? Why had they been monitoring me? I immediately turned off the recorder and brought it inside, my mind racing with questions. I contacted the police and reported the incident. An officer arrived quickly and took the device for further examination. They assured me they would investigate, but the days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of paranoia. Every time I got into my car, I felt like I was being watched. The police investigation was thorough but slow-moving. The recorder had no identifying marks or traces, making it impossible to figure out who had planted it. I had my car checked professionally, but nothing else unusual was found. I also started keeping a log of any suspicious activity around my vehicle. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation went cold. The case was eventually marked as unresolved, leaving me with more questions than answers. I installed a new security system and became much more cautious about discussing personal matters, even in what I thought were private spaces. The experience left me with a lingering sense of vulnerability. I never discovered who was behind the recorder or why it was placed in my car, but the event became a constant reminder of the potential dangers lurking in the shadows. It taught me the importance of vigilance, privacy, and being aware of the world around me. The mystery may have remained unsolved, but the lesson was clear: the need to protect one's privacy in an increasingly invasive world. Story 22. It was a cold November morning when the first package arrived, almost unnoticed among the usual clutter of junk mail and deliveries. It was a small, plain box wrapped in brown paper, with no markings or labels. At first, I thought it was a misdelivered item or perhaps a gift from a friend who forgot to include a note. Curious but not alarmed, I brought the box inside and opened it. Inside, I found a photograph of myself, taken from a distance during a recent trip to the park. I was initially shocked but quickly dismissed it as an odd coincidence or a strange joke. I checked the box again, hoping to find a note or any clue about who sent it, but there was nothing: no name, no return address, just the unsettling photo. Over the next few days, more packages arrived, each one just as nondescript as the first. Inside, the contents became increasingly disturbing. One box contained a handwritten note, detailing a recent trip to a nearby city, even mentioning a cafe I had visited and the clothes I had worn. Another package held a collection of old, faded receipts from a store where I frequently shopped, including some I had forgotten about. The most disturbing package came one evening while I was cooking dinner. It contained a bundle of items taken from my trash, an old grocery receipt, a crumpled ticket stub, and an empty envelope with my name and address on it. It was clear that someone had been rummaging through my garbage, collecting personal information. A sense of dread and paranoia began to set in. Who could be doing this? And why? As the days passed, the packages continued to arrive, each one more invasive than the last. One contained a personal letter I had written to a friend, another a snippet of a conversation I had with a neighbor. The worst package included a lock of hair, seemingly cut from a brush I had used. It became obvious that someone was not just watching my life, they were intruding on it, piece by piece. I contacted the authorities, and they took my concerns seriously. An officer came to collect the evidence, assuring me they would investigate the situation. Meanwhile, I took additional precautions to secure my home: extra locks, security cameras, and motion-activated lights. Despite these efforts, the sense of violation lingered. The police investigation revealed that the packages had been sent from different locations, making it hard to trace the sender. They suspected that the perpetrator was using stolen identities or fake addresses. Though the packages eventually stopped arriving, the fear and anxiety continued. I found myself second-guessing every interaction, constantly looking over my shoulder, and being hyper-aware of my surroundings. The situation worsened when I started receiving anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Brief and silent, they only intensified my growing paranoia. After tracing the calls, the authorities found they originated from a pay phone miles away, but the identity of the caller remained unknown. Eventually, both the packages and the phone calls stopped, and though the investigation remained open, there were no leads. The ordeal left me shaken, my sense of security shattered. I found comfort in discussing the experience with friends and family, and I became more vigilant about protecting my privacy. The event also prompted me to take steps to safeguard my personal information and home security, and I sought therapy to help process the trauma. Though the identity of the person behind it all remains a mystery, the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of personal safety, leaving me more determined than ever to protect my privacy in a world where it is increasingly vulnerable. Story 23. It was an unusually warm September evening when I first noticed something odd. I had just come home from work, exhausted and ready for a quiet night, when I glanced out the window and saw my trash can sitting by the curb. At first, I thought nothing of it, until I realized that the garbage collector must have already come, but something still felt off. The next morning, when I went to take out the trash, I noticed the can had been rummaged through. Items were scattered about as if someone had been sifting through them. I frowned, thinking it was either a stray animal or maybe some kids playing pranks, but the feeling stuck with me. Soon after, I began finding items in my trash that I hadn't thrown away. It started with an old receipt from a store I hadn't visited in months. Then a torn page from a notebook with personal notes on it. The items seemed too specific and personal to be random. Things escalated when I found a half-opened envelope, clearly rifled through, containing old documents and letters I had kept for sentimental reasons. I was certain I had placed the envelope in a secure drawer. This felt invasive. The idea that someone had been going through my trash made my skin crawl. It was as if they were trying to piece together parts of my life without my consent. I decided to take action. I secured my trash can more carefully, but the unsettling incidents continued. One night, after a long day, I heard rustling noises outside. Peeking through the blinds, I saw a shadowy figure near my trash can. My heart raced. There was no mistaking it, someone was going through my garbage. The next morning, I installed a small security camera near the trash can, hoping to capture any suspicious activity. A few days later, I reviewed the footage. It was grainy, but clear enough to show a person approaching the trash can and sifting through it with care, as though they were looking for something specific. I showed the footage to the police, and while they expressed concern, they said that unless there was a violation of property or personal privacy, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to continue monitoring the situation and to shred any sensitive documents before discarding them. I also locked my trash can. But even with these precautions, the feeling of intrusion didn't go away. Over time, the frequency of these incidents decreased, but I remained vigilant, taking steps to protect my privacy and security. Although the person's identity and motivations remained unknown, the experience was a harsh reminder of how vulnerable our personal space can be. It highlighted the importance of safeguarding personal information and the impact such violations can have on one's sense of security. Story 24. The first letter came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had just returned from work, drenched from the downpour, and was about to start my evening when I noticed an envelope sticking out of my mailbox. It was plain, unmarked, except for my name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Hesitant, I opened it. Inside, a letter detailed a recent dinner party I had hosted, mentioning conversations with friends and specific events from the evening. The final line read, "I hope you enjoyed your evening." It was quite the spectacle. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke, maybe a prank from someone who knew about the party. But as I couldn't find any clue about the sender, I pushed the thought aside. A week later, however, another letter arrived. This one described a private conversation I'd had with my sister on the phone, including personal details and advice I had given her about her job. The closing line was chilling, "You seem to give good advice, it's a shame you don't follow it yourself." I started to worry. Who could know such intimate details? I checked my phone for any unusual activity, but nothing seemed out of place. The third letter was even more unsettling. It mentioned an ongoing dispute I had with a colleague at work and ended with a thinly veiled threat, "Be careful where you tread at work, your adversaries are closer than you think." Now, I was genuinely scared. I contacted the police, and they began an investigation, but tracing anonymous letters proved difficult. The letters continued, each one more detailed and intrusive than the last, mentioning my personal matters, even details of a doctor's appointment. One letter ended with, "Your secrets are safe with me, for now." The investigation led nowhere, and I grew more anxious. I scrutinized my daily interactions, hoping to identify a person with access to such intimate details. The police analyzed the handwriting in the envelope, but nothing stood out. Desperate for answers, I enlisted a private investigator, who uncovered that the letters were sent from various places around the city but seemed to originate from a central location near an office building I had passed many times. Through further investigation, the private investigator tracked down a former private investigator who had been sending the letters. He had lost his license for unethical practices and had been using his knowledge to invade my privacy. The police arrested him, and the case went to court. While the trial was emotionally draining, seeing justice served gave me a sense of relief. The ordeal left me shaken, but I took steps to improve my security and remain vigilant. The experience reinforced the importance of protecting personal privacy in an increasingly intrusive world, and though the violation lingered, I felt empowered to take back control of my life. Story 25. The dinner party had been a success, an evening filled with laughter, delicious food, and great conversation. I had spent weeks planning the event, carefully choosing the menu, arranging the seating, and ensuring everything was perfect. My guests had all arrived in high spirits, and the night had gone just as I had hoped. As the evening drew to a close, guests began leaving, thanking me for the wonderful time and expressing their enjoyment. After the final goodbyes, I began cleaning up, basking in the satisfaction of a well-executed event. While tidying up the living room, I noticed something odd, a small black device hidden behind a decorative vase on the side table. I picked it up and realized it was a voice recorder. My heart sank as I turned it off. It seemed to be recording, and I couldn't help but wonder, who had planted this device and how long had it been capturing our conversations. I took the memory card and connected it to my computer. As the files loaded, I felt increasingly uneasy. The audio files were organized by date and time, and as I listened, I heard the conversations from the evening replaying, clear and disturbing in their detail. The device had captured everything, from casual chats in the dining room to more intimate discussions in quieter corners of the house. The realization that someone had secretly recorded these private moments was deeply violating. I immediately contacted the police, who took the device for further analysis. They investigated the situation, but no clues emerged about the person responsible. Meanwhile, I reviewed the security footage from the night, hoping to identify any suspicious behavior. Despite careful analysis, nothing stood out. The emotional impact was profound. My home, once a place of comfort and trust, now felt like a symbol of distrust and violation. I installed more security cameras and swept the house for other hidden devices, but the feeling of being watched never fully dissipated. Despite the investigation stalling, I took steps to restore my sense of security. I increased my vigilance and took more proactive measures to protect my privacy. The experience left me acutely aware of how vulnerable we are in our personal spaces, and it highlighted the importance of safeguarding privacy in an increasingly intrusive world. Even though the immediate threat had been dealt with, the emotional toll remained, a constant reminder of the fragility of our sense of security.